We've worked with Jeffrey Rosen for many years, and it's really special to me that he's running now the National Constitution Center, which is a significant organization based in Philadelphia that explains and tries to educate our public and now our children about the Constitution. And if you were here last year, you know that Mr. Rubenstein has this incredibly beautiful attitude about philanthropy and investing in our country's documents and history, and his own knowledge of the Constitution and all of these documents is spectacular. I don't know if you actually brought one. Did you bring one this year?
I didn't bring it with me, sorry.
He's been known to show up with things like the Declaration and the Magna Carta. You really let us down. Anyway, welcome to David and Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kitty. It is such a pleasure to be here and such a pleasure to be back with David talking about the founding documents. So here is the backstory on this conversation. As Kitty mentioned, I now have the privilege of running the National Constitution Center. It's this beautiful museum and education center in Philadelphia that has a charter from Congress to disseminate information about the Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And David has very generously lent us a Declaration of Independence, a rare declaration, and we're displaying that along with a rare original copy of the Constitution and one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights. George Washington sent only 13 out to the states, and the federal government, 12 survive, and this is one of them. So we're building a beautiful new gallery, and David came to the center to talk about the relationship between the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And this man is so spectacular and so knowledgeable and so able to communicate historical ideas to the citizens of America that we decided to transcribe our conversation and write it up as a pamphlet. And I brought one here, and we're going to distribute it around the country and put it online. And this is David and my conversation about the relationship between the Constitution, the Declaration, and the Bill of Rights. So now I want to put David to work creating some more pamphlets that we can display at the Constitution Center and distribute. We have to talk about the ratification history of the Constitution. How is it possible that the document got from point A to point B? And then we're going to talk about the history of the subsequent amendments to the Constitution, including the Great Reconstruction Amendments, ending slavery, guaranteeing equality, and giving African Americans the right to vote, all of which turn 150 over the next few years. So that's why it's so important that you showed up this morning. It's a small and hearty BAM at 8 a.m., but there's a lot at stake in this conversation, because if we mess it up, then the pamphlet is not going to be perfect. So take careful notes. I'm going to ask David questions, and you are about to hear the master American storyteller and historian explaining everything that you should know about the ratification history of the Constitution. So thank you so much for being here, David.
In 35 minutes.
In 35 minutes. Then you can ask some questions as well. I'll just start. It's July 2nd, and July 2nd was a special day for the Declaration of Independence. It's also the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so this is a very important day in constitutional history. First, start by telling us, why was July 2nd important to the framers of the Declaration of Independence?
Well, as I think most people here probably know, it was July the 2nd that the Second Continental Congress decided to vote independence from England. And that was a debate that had been scheduled for a while. It occurred for over a few days, and July the 2nd was the day that they actually voted to be independent. It was 12 of the states that were there that voted for it. New York was not there at the time. And John Adams wrote to his wife, Abigail, that this will be the most important day in the history of America, and for 1,000 years we'll celebrate this with fireworks. So some of you may say, why do we celebrate the 4th of July? Well, very briefly, and I will be brief because I think I've told this story to some of you before, right after they had the vote on July the 2nd, they took up a document that Thomas Jefferson had largely drafted as part of a committee of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And that document was really just supposed to be an explanation to the public of why we were breaking away. It was called the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. He came up with the title. It didn't have any legal impact. There was no legal force to it. It was just a propaganda document, you could say. They began the debate on it on July the 2nd, and the 3rd, and the 4th. And finally on the 4th, after changing about 35% of what Jefferson had written, it was agreed to. And it wasn't seen as that significant at the time because they continued business the rest of the day. It wasn't like as if they said, okay, we just agreed to the Declaration of Independence, let's go pat ourselves on the back and have a drink or something. They just continued on their business. They then arranged to have it printed, distributed around the United States. George Washington got a copy to read to the troops, sent a copy to King George, and so forth. And the reason we celebrate the 4th of July rather than the 2nd is because 1 year later, when the Continental Congress was in session, they were so busy on July the 2nd, they forgot until the end of the day that it was July the 2nd. So they said, oh no. So they said, we got to celebrate. So it took them a day, July the 3rd, to organize the celebration that occurred on July the 4th. So they celebrated on July the 4th. Now, this is historically not that significant, I guess, whether you celebrate July the 2nd or July the 4th, but it was the two people. John Adams was the person who thought the most significant thing in the world was the day we voted to be independent. That was the real vote. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, obviously thought July the 4th was more important because we agreed the language. So over the 50 years from that point on that they both lived, they died exactly 50 years today on July the 4th later. They had a personal relationship that was off and on, but I think they didn't like the fact John Adams didn't like the fact they were celebrating July the 4th, and of course Thomas Jefferson thought that it was the appropriate day. So what goes forward, just to get to the point where we're going to get to the Constitution Convention. So when we're fighting the war, July the 4th happens, and we're in the middle of a war. The war goes on from 1776 to 1781. During the course of it, about 8,000 American troops are killed in combat, and probably about 25,000 overall are killed, mostly from illness and malnutrition and other kinds of things. So we lost ultimately 25,000 troops in this war. The British lost more. And ultimately, the war is ended in 1781, and a peace agreement, the Treaty of Paris, is finalized in 1783. So who was running the country from 1776 to 1783? Well, after the Second Continental Congress, an Articles of Confederation was drafted, and that was what operated to operate the country. And it really was a very unique document. Remember, the 13 states had not been considered among themselves one country. They were 13 colonies that had their own independent relationship with England. And it was pointed out that when the Continental Congress first started, the delegates who came from the 13 states, more of them had been to London than had ever been to Philadelphia. Philadelphia was then the biggest city in the United States. Its population was 40,000. And it was a very rural country. 98% of the people in the country at that time lived on farms. Only 2% lived in cities. So different country than the one we know today. Today, 98% of people live in cities and only 2% on farms, exact opposite. So they came up with a way to govern themselves during the war and after the war. And that system was called the Articles of Confederation. And it basically said each state would come together in a kind of legislative body with each state having one vote. The Articles of Confederation did not have a presidency. There was no executive branch. There was no judicial branch. And there also was no ability to tax. So if they needed money to pay off foreign debts, which they had accumulated during the war, they needed money to organize, to pay troops, they didn't have that. There was no taxing ability. And to change the amendment, the Articles of Confederation, it took 13 votes. Every state had to agree unanimously. So nothing was really getting done. And as a result, the country was drifting to the point where we weren't paying our foreign debts. The country didn't have any sense of unity. There was a fear that actually many people in the country said, why don't we reunite with England, because the country was better run and better united when we were part of England. That didn't happen, but what happened was some people who were not happy with the Articles of Confederation began a little plot to overthrow the government, you could say, a non-violent overthrow of the government. And the plot was basically this. The idea was to get a group of people together who would try to push the idea of having a convention to kind of draft up a new Articles of Confederation, to amend the Articles of Confederation. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton led that effort, and they met in Annapolis, and they had a meeting designed to do something else, but they ultimately decided that they would push for a new agreement to how to run the country. And they got the Articles of Confederation Congress to agree to call a constitutional convention. It was very novel. The Articles of Confederation Congress, why would they want to call a convention to, in effect, replace themselves? They didn't quite realize what they were doing because they thought this was just going to amend the Articles of Confederation. And in fact, they issued a call saying let's have a constitutional convention which will amend the Articles of Confederation, not replace it, but just amend it. And so they put a call out to all the states, 13 states, and they said, send delegates. This was to be started in May of 1787. And that was the call to the Constitutional Convention. It was to be in Philadelphia.
Excellent. Okay, so put us in the mind of George Washington, who's being summoned to attend this new convention. As you say, there's some question about its legality. He's not sure whether it'll succeed. What considerations are going through his mind as he decides whether or not to attend?
Remember, George Washington, the two most famous people in the United States were Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. Washington was famous for, obviously, having been the general in the war and won the war. And after the war was over, and he went back to Mount Vernon, and he'd been away from Mount Vernon for 8 years. When he went back, it was reported to King George that George Washington had laid down his armaments, in effect, and gone back to Mount Vernon. And he said, if it's true, he's the greatest man on the face of the earth. And why would he say that? Because generally, when you were a general and you won a war, you became in charge of the government. You put yourself in charge of it. There was no great history in the last 1,000 years of somebody running a war, winning a war, and then just saying, I don't want power, I just want to go back and mind my business. But he did that. And he went back to Mount Vernon and tended to his plantation. He was not all that healthy. He left, when the war was over, he was in his 50s, but he had rheumatoid arthritis and he had some other debilitating problems. So he wasn't really in great physical shape, although for that age, for that period of time, that was a relatively old age. He was about 55 at the time. In any event, George Washington had the most prestige of anybody in the country. And it was generally viewed by James Madison and others that if George Washington would be part of the Virginia delegation to the Constitutional Convention, it would be taken seriously. However, people who had worked for George Washington in the war, people who were his lieutenants and colonels and so forth, they were communicating with him and saying, you shouldn't lend your prestige to this because, one, it's not likely to succeed, and two, you really can damage your reputation. You could be part of something that won't work, and if it doesn't work, you'll get blamed. Right now, you're already very, very popular. People respect you. Don't lend your prestige to it. Ultimately, George Washington thought that he had fought a war and he had tried to make the country a great country, and the country was heading south, and he thought that he owed that obligation to the country to participate. So he agreed with James Madison and others that he would show up as part of the Virginia delegation.
Okay, so as you say, another member of the Virginia delegation was James Madison. He was especially concerned about the economic chaos of the Articles of Confederation. He was afraid of Shays' Rebellion, the debtor rebellion in Massachusetts, where the debtors didn't want to pay their creditors. Put us in James Madison's mind and tell us what were his principal concerns about correcting the vices of the Articles of Confederation, and how did he want to do that in the Constitutional Convention?
James Madison was the son of a very wealthy man in Orange County, Virginia. He was one of, I think, 11 children, and he was the oldest of them. He had been a relatively sickly person as a young boy, and in fact, was so sickly that they thought that he shouldn't spend time in Virginia in college because there was, I'd say the weather wasn't as good and other things. And so they sent him to New Jersey, to what's now called Princeton, and where he turned out to be an excellent student. He came back, and he wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life. He didn't want to be what his father was, a property landowner. He wanted to do something significant. He got more involved in government and so forth. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, he was, I think, just 36 years old, 36. So he was relatively young. His view was that the reason the Articles of Confederation had failed and the government was going nowhere is that there was no executive. And the reason there had been no executive under the Articles of Confederation is that when the Articles of Confederation was set up, the main concern was we didn't want to have another King George. King George was considered a terrible person, a tyrant, and so forth, even though he probably wasn't. But they didn't really want to have a strong executive, so they created no executive. Not having an executive, nobody was providing any leadership. So Madison thought you needed leadership. He also thought that the Articles of Confederation had a major failure in that every state was equal. So a state with 30,000 people, Delaware, had as many votes in the Articles of Confederation Congress as Virginia, which was the most populous state with about 830,000 people. He thought that wasn't fair, and what you should do is have a representative system under which every state was represented proportionately. So if Virginia had 5 times or 10 times the population of some other state, they should have 5 or 10 times the population or representation in the Congress. And so he wanted to propose a plan which would do that. And what happened was, when the Congress was going to come together, the Constitutional Convention, in May of 1787, people didn't move that quickly as they do today. Things weren't as scheduled. So they were supposed to show up in May, excuse me, but you know, they got there late. There's the rainstorms. People traveled in very slow ways. To get from let's say, Mount Vernon to Philadelphia would probably take about a week or so on a carriage or horse and so forth. So what happened was the Virginia delegation got to Philadelphia early. They were on time, but nobody else was on time. And the Pennsylvania delegation was already there because they're mostly from Philadelphia. So the Virginia delegation and the Pennsylvania delegation spent some time together, and they kind of came up with an idea of making sure that the big states were adequately represented. So the Congress would have a system where people had proportionate representation. They were going to have 2 houses of Congress, just as they had in the British Parliament, a lower house and an upper house. The lower house would be proportionally represented, just as the House of Representatives is today, but the upper house, the Senate today, would be proportionally represented. So there would be no distinction between small states, and the distinction between small states and big states would evaporate in the sense that everybody would be proportionally represented. You wouldn't have a system, as we do have today, where each state has 2 votes in the Senate. Madison didn't want that. The House was to be represented by, under his plan, his idea that the Virginia and Pennsylvania delegation came up with, by people voting for it, but they didn't really trust people to vote very much, so they wanted to have an upper house, the Senate they later called it, that would be voted on by somebody else, and they ultimately decided to have the state legislatures vote for the senators. But the idea that Madison had was have a strong executive and have proportionate representation in both houses of Congress.
Okay, beautifully said. So Madison's goal is a government energetic enough to have taxes and provide for war, but not too powerful to menace the rights of the people. And he proposed to do that, as you've said, with this Virginia plan based on proportional representation. But that didn't go over very well with the small states, who were afraid that their power would be swamped by those of the big ones. Tell us about the response of the small states and what they proposed in response.
When the Constitutional Convention convened in May, and it's a very interesting group, you have 55 people ultimately were there. Ultimately, 39 men signed it, but 55 people at one point or 9, and others showed up representing the states. The average age was 44. They were the youngest, about 12 of them were under 35. The oldest was Benjamin Franklin, who was 80. And they were mostly well-educated property people. They were, of the 55, 25 of them had been and were slave owners, 16 of whom made most of their money from the operation of plantations or other things where slavery was the principal way that they were making money, the use of slavery. So it was a cross-section, you could say, of the country, but cross-section of white males who were reasonably well-educated and all Christians. As far as I could see, there was no Jewish people in the...
That's really too bad. I think it would have been a better document.
So, the man who actually engrossed the Constitution was named Jacob Shamus. I never figured out if he was Jewish, but anyway. So,
God willing.
They came together, and when the Constitutional Convention opened, Madison, who liked to operate behind the scenes, he had a former governor, or the current governor of Virginia, Mr. Randolph, propose what was called the Virginia Plan. And that basically said 2 houses of Congress, an executive, but the houses of Congress, both houses of Congress would be proportionally represented. The smaller states said, wait a second, we'll be wiped out. If everything's proportional representation, who's going to care what Delaware says or New Hampshire? So they came back with another plan they called the New Jersey Plan, which basically said that at least in one house of Congress, there should be, each state would have the same number of votes. It could be 1 or 2, but each state would be, in effect, represented equally in one house. And that began the effort to have a major debate throughout the Congress, throughout the Constitutional Convention, of how to resolve these various issues. And what they would do is George Washington was selected to be the chairman of the Constitutional Convention. He was selected right away, and it was known he would be the chairman. But when you're the chairman of that, you have to, you have votes and so forth, and you operate in a very formal way. And so that they could enable themselves to have informal debates, they decided to operate mostly from what was called a committee of the whole. So they had somebody else who would preside over the committee of the whole, and that person would allow them to have debates, and when they would have votes, the votes didn't really mean anything. They were just kind of informing people of what relative positions were. So they'd have a debate, maybe they'd have a vote on it, maybe they wouldn't, and they would cover a variety of different things. Well, they began to discuss this issue early on. They couldn't resolve it, whether there should be proportional representation or small state representation in the Senate. So they kind of passed over that and they went on to other issues like the presidency and other things.
So really take us through how this conflict between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan was resolved. I gather there's another July 2nd anniversary. July 2nd, 1787 was the day that Abraham Baldwin of Georgia switched his vote and sided with the small states, keeping them in the mix. And it was Roger Sherman of Connecticut who kind of brokered the compromise, and then Franklin came up with the proposal that would ultimately be in the Constitution. Take us through that fascinating story.
Well, what happened is this was not getting resolved quickly, and so they went on to many other subjects, and there always were during the 4-month period of time of the Constitutional Convention, they would go back and forth to try to resolve this. In the end, the Connecticut delegation, led by Roger Sherman in this particular instance, came up with a plan that we actually live with today, which is proportionate representation in the lower house, and each state would be represented equally in the upper house, which they called the Senate. And that was something that Madison very much did not like. He thought that was a terrible idea because he thought in the end each state would operate on its own parochial interest. In other words, he was concerned that under the Articles of Confederation, people only thought of themselves as states and not as Americans. And he wanted more and more people to think of themselves as Americans and not as residents of New Jersey or residents of Georgia, whatever the state would be. And he was concerned that by having people still vote as a state, in effect, in the Senate, you would have that problem. But in the end, he got outvoted, and ultimately Roger Sherman worked out a compromise that others agreed to, and it was thought that that was probably the best way to proceed. Today, we think probably it's logical. How could you not have it this way? Because the small states would be ignored completely in the Congress if they weren't in the Senate. But in those days, it wasn't considered so obvious. In fact, most of the large states didn't take seriously the small states' concerns initially. But in the end, the only way to get the agreement to go forward was this. The small states said if they didn't get this, in the end, they were going to walk away and they would leave the Constitutional Convention. So that was a compromise that had to get done.
So as you described this, it was really population that was the central dispute in the convention. But there was another looming issue that affected population, and that, of course, was slavery. The southern states wanted to count their slaves for the purpose of being represented, but didn't want to give them the vote. Tell us about how that issue was resolved and James Wilson's idea of the 3/5 clause. How did that play into the story?
Well, what is government all about but power? Who has the power? And so when you're imagine if you were in the Constitutional Convention, you're from one of these states, you're worried about the power in your state and your livelihood and so forth. So everything was really about who was going to have the power or so. So if you're going to have proportionate representation, how do you decide who is being represented? Well, there were they didn't really know how many people were in each state for sure. They never had a census. They had informal understandings, but didn't really have a real census. But one of the real issues was, what do you do with the slaves? How do you count the slaves? Are they counted as people or are they counted as property? Well, obviously, the southern states, and remember, slavery was still around in the northern states. It wasn't that prevalent, but there was slavery in the northern states, not as big, but in the southern states, increasingly, they were becoming more and more dependent on it, particularly South Carolina and Georgia. And to some extent North Carolina. So, and that's because they were producing crops, tobacco and others, that required a lot of manual labor. And so the slavery system was one that was very conducive to that. And they thought that that was necessary for their livelihood. So their view was that we need to count the slaves as people, because if we're going to be proportionally represented, we will have too small a population and not have enough people representing us in the House. Well, the people in the North said, wait a second, these are slaves. They're not, you count them as property. They have no rights. How can all of a sudden you say they should count? Well, in the Articles of Confederation at one point, under that system, they had tried to figure out, for purposes of maybe having a tax, which they didn't have, how you would count, how you would value each state's contribution for the purpose of a tax. In other words, they were thinking in the Articles of Confederation of saying, let's have the ability to do some taxing, which they didn't do. And in figuring out how they would allocate each state's amount of tax owed, they were going to do it according to population. And in that system, under the Articles of Confederation, they were saying that a slave would contribute to the relative GDP 3/5 of what a white person would contribute. So if a white person would contribute a certain amount of dollars to the income of the state, a slave's value was thought to be 60%. How they got that, nobody really knows. So they kept that in the back of their minds, and so when this debate came up in the Constitutional Convention, they went back to the 3/5 formula. And ultimately, that was agreed to, and as we all know, the southern states had the right to count as part of their population proportionate representation for the House and taxation purposes. Each slave would count as 3/5 of one person.
And, well, first of all, tell us, were they embarrassed by this compromise? James Madison was ambivalent about slaveholding.
If you go back and try to find out what actually occurred in the Constitutional Convention, it's very interesting. We only know from very limited sources, because when they agreed to meet in the Constitutional Convention, one of the rules was secrecy. They were not supposed to tell anybody what they were doing, and actually they pretty much kept to that. So the letters that were written by people to their relatives or friends didn't really tell much about what was going on. Their reporters didn't really know, and so secrecy was very important. But in order to have a record, at the beginning they picked a secretary. They elected a man named William Jackson to keep the records of what was going on. Unfortunately, he was not as attentive to the record keeping as he should have been, and he spent time on other stuff. But fortunately, James Madison managed to keep a record. He sat in the front, make sure he could hear everything. And although he was participating in the debates, he was keeping a very, very detailed record. And every night he would go home to his rented apartment. They all lived in various boarding houses. And he would, in effect, rewrite his notes so that they could be understood by future people and by himself. And ultimately, his dialogue, or his description of the dialogue and his notes, became the only real record of what was really said in the Constitutional Convention. But because it was very sensitive, he didn't actually let it be published until after he died. So it was published about more than 40 years after the events occurred. That's how we know most of what happened. But on your question, the moral outrage that each of us would have about talking about slavery didn't quite exist. There were people who said, you know, how can we have such a terrible system? But they didn't feel so strongly about it as they did about the economics related to it. So the moral outrage that probably should have existed in just talking about slavery didn't really exist, and nobody talked about getting rid of slavery at the Constitutional Convention. Had they done so, the southern states would have pulled out. And as they made it clear, if we're going to talk about anything relating to the real operation of slavery, we will leave. And there was some debate about it, and ultimately one of the related issues was this: how much longer can we tolerate the system of slavery? Well, they didn't really think they were going to get rid of it, but they did decide to ban the importation of new slaves. Originally, it was going to be 10 years after the ratification. Ultimately, I think it was 20 years after the ratification of the Constitutional Convention, of the Constitution. No more slaves would be imported. Now, that wouldn't have eliminated slavery because slaves were reproducing and so forth, but the feeling was that we shouldn't have more slaves coming in because that would exacerbate the problem. They were worried about what was going to happen in the new states that came into the Union, the western states. Would they be slave states or anti-slave states? And to kind of deal with that issue, they basically said, let's have fewer slaves in the country. Fewer slaves in the country will mean that probably in the western states they won't be pro-slavery states.
And the significance of that compromise is noted in the fact that the clause regarding the importation of slaves until 1800 was unamendable. And there's a real constitutional question about whether you're allowed to make an unamendable provision of the Constitution or whether that violates popular sovereignty. Tell us about the other big debates. The presidency. Alexander Hamilton wanted something like a monarch and said stuff that he later was embarrassed by. What was his position on the presidency and how was it resolved?
Think about this. On our currency, we have two people who are not presidents of the United States. One of them is Benjamin Franklin, and he's on the, anybody know? $100 bill, the main currency in Russia and other places. And then the other person is Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was, some people debate or not, the illegitimate son of maybe a prominent person in the West Indies. He actually was recognized as being a brilliant young person. He got a scholarship, in effect, or people helped him get money to come up to go to what's now called Columbia. And very, very brilliant. Some people might say he was the highest IQ person at the Constitutional Convention, but he came in and out, wasn't there that much. A couple times he made speeches saying, you know what, the British government is the best system. Why don't we have a strong leader like the king, and why don't we kind of have a parliament like the British? And people are looking at him and say, don't you know, we just fought this war. We don't want the British system. So he wasn't listened to all that much at that time. He was only about 30 years old, or early 30s at the time of this.
Oh my God. You know the Tom Lehrer line that it's sobering to think that when Mozart was my age, he'd been dead for 3 years.
Right. Well, these guys, they were very young.
Yes.
So the debate was, should we have an executive or not have an executive? And because there was no executive in the Articles of Confederation, Madison and others thought we needed an executive. That was part of the original Virginia plan. Nobody had said we shouldn't have an executive. The question was, how do you pick one and what authority does he have? So they went through many different ideas, but the idea was you never let people vote for the president. That people are uninformed, they don't know how to pick, so forth. So the idea was you'd either have the Congress vote for the president. The problem was that would make the president be very beholden to Congress, and therefore probably he wouldn't be that independent of them. So ultimately they came up with a system of letting the state legislatures in effect vote for it, but they didn't really want the state legislatures to have too much influence either. So someone came up with you could say a reasonably clever but extremely complicated system. The state legislators would pick electors. Electors would pick the president. And that's the system we have, the Electoral College. And so that was a system that they came up with. It was designed to make sure the president wasn't beholden to the Congress and not completely beholden to the state legislatures, because the legislatures would be picking people who would be the electors. It wasn't the legislators themselves that would be picking the president. And they debated for a long time, how long should somebody serve as president? And the original plan that Madison had, I think, was to have the president serve for 7 years and 1 7-year term. Ultimately, as we know, they had no term limits on president or Congress at all. And ultimately, we amended the Constitution, as you all know, to limit it to 2 terms. But they actually came out with a constitution which had no term limits. But the president was to be elected by this very convoluted system. And as to the authority he would have, they went back and forth. They gave a number of authorities to the president. They didn't envision a president being as strong as the one we have today. They all thought that the power was really going to be in the Congress, and the president would be an executive to implement a lot of what Congress wanted, and he would be able to do certain things, but he wouldn't be able to declare war. He couldn't decide to raise your taxes. The Congress would have to do that. So the president had authority, but it was somewhat limited.
And tell us about the debate over the courts. The principle of judicial review, the idea that courts can strike down unconstitutional laws, was present in English common law. There were cases from the 1760s, but it's not explicit in the Constitution. What did they decide to do about the courts? Well,
during the 4 months of debate, they debated many different things, but judiciary got a relatively modest amount of attention. And so ultimately they had, let's say, about 23 different major subjects that they could deal with: the executive, the legislative, judiciary, other things. And they created a committee to kind of take all the votes they have and come together and figure out how to distill what they've been debating for many months. And that committee came up with basically 7 articles of the Constitution. And Article 1 was the legislative, Article 2 was the executive, which is how they thought it was. The legislative was more important. And then Article 3 was the judiciary. Judiciary didn't really get as much attention in the constitutional debates as you would expect today. They basically said, we'll have a court system. The court system will be independent. They debated who should pick the judges. Originally, it was going to be picked by the Congress, but ultimately they decided to let the President of the United States pick with the advice and consent of the Senate. It was originally going to be with the House, but then they made it the Senate. And so that's a system. They didn't debate what we now know is one of the most important things the Supreme Court and the courts do, which is determine whether a law is constitutional or not. Although there had been a big tradition of that in England, they didn't really say in the Constitution, the judges can decide whether a law is constitutional or not. And so not until Marbury versus Madison did we really get into a system where we were really having the judges to say, yes, the law is unconstitutional or not.
I want everyone to understand the major procedural moves. So what was the difference between this committee of detail and the committee of style? How did those differences get worked out?
The committee on detail was a committee that was designed to take the 23 various subjects they debated and distill them into agreements that they could all, into positions that they could all agree on, more or less. The committee on style came up at the end, and it was designed to actually write it up. And it was led by really a man named Gouverneur Morris, who was from Pennsylvania, and he actually wrote out what is the Constitution, in fact, and it was his handwriting, in effect. And they took a lot of the ideas from the committee on detail, and then they had the committee on style actually write it up.
Were there important substantive differences in the Committee on Style? The famous preamble to the Constitution originally read, "We the people of the various states," and it was changed to "We the people of the United States." How was that change made?
Well, in the Committee on Style, when they were actually writing up the document, they had been working from a draft that said, "We the people of," and they named every single state. But they eliminated that, and the reason they did that was, I think, they wanted to, simplify, because they said we want to have a short preamble, we don't want to have a long preamble like the Declaration of Independence, but also they wanted to make it clear in the end that it was the people and not the states who were coming together, because there was a fear that if the states were coming together to create this Constitution, in the end, you would really get back to the same problems you had in the Articles of Confederation. The states were really running the country and not the people. And so they wanted to give more power to the federal government, and therefore they said, "We the people," as opposed to "We the people of New Jersey," or so forth and so on.
So this crucial difference, moving from the idea that the states were sovereign to the idea that the people of the United States as a whole were sovereign, was the major intellectual shift in the convention. It was championed by James Wilson, but it wasn't until the Civil War that the question was decisively settled, and Lincoln insisted that because the people of the United States were sovereign, individual states could not secede.
Right. That's correct. And as you know, we debate these issues today a great deal still, whether a state has certain rights or not. At the time, those people who wanted a stronger federal government were trying to be very careful and not say to the people who wanted the states to be strong that they were going to take away their power. They were very concerned about being perceived as really taking away the right of states to exist and to do things like tax people and things like that. So it was a balance, but it was a bit of a sleight of hand, too. By saying "we the people," in effect, they were saying it's really the people of the country and not the states that are coming together.
So this question of states' rights and federal power culminated in the biggest objection to the Constitution, and that was the lack of a Bill of Rights. And this is a fascinating story, and why don't you tell it through the lens of Mr. Morris, who was initially for the Constitution, but came to object to it because it lacked a Bill of Rights. How did that story play out?
Okay. Most states had constitutions which had Bill of Rights in them. So when they came around to the debate of whether we need a Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution, there was very little debate about it, relatively speaking, on the 4 months. Toward the end, it was discussed, but the people like James Madison, who said, we don't really need it because each of the states have their own constitution and the rights are in there, why do we need to replicate that? And actually there was a fear that if the federal government said we have certain rights, how would you know what all the rights are, and if you didn't list a specific right, then somebody would say you didn't have it. They thought it was just easier to say the rights are really embodied in the state constitutions, and we're not taking that. At the end of the Constitutional Convention, 3 people decided not to vote for the Constitution. They'd been there the entire time, and they decided not to vote for it and not to sign it. Of the 55 that were there, 39 signed, but 3 did not sign largely because of the Bill of Rights, the most famous of which was George Mason. George Mason, who was a leader in Virginia, a very good friend of George Washington's, said without a Bill of Rights, we can't really have a real Constitution. Of course, he had drafted the Bill of Rights for the Virginia Constitution, and therefore he thought the Bill of Rights was very important. The others were Randolph, also from Virginia, and Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts. They were the 3 who decided, because of the no Bill of Rights, among other issues, they weren't going to sign onto it. So Madison very much argued that there should be no Bill of Rights. It wasn't necessary because the state constitutions had it. But in the ratification process, it wasn't going all that easily. In other words, once the Constitution was agreed to and it was signed by the members and they went home, they had to have it ratified. And how were you going to ratify this? What was the procedure? So do you ratify it by going back to the Articles of Confederation Congress? Well, that probably wouldn't work because you're getting rid of them, so they probably wouldn't vote for it. Did you go to the state legislatures? Well, there was a fear that the state legislatures might not like this because a lot of their power was being taken away. So the system was you were going to have state legislatures call state conventions, and they would approve or not approve the Constitution that was agreed to in Philadelphia. And that was the system they went forward with. And so each state was supposed to go ahead with its own state convention. Many of these that debated it wanted to have amendments to the Constitution, but it was an up or down vote. You either voted for it or you didn't because there weren't going to be any amendments allowed. But it was recognized that a lot of people wanted to have in states a Bill of Rights. And so Madison more or less agreed, as enabled to, when he wanted to get it approved by Virginia, it was very close in Virginia, that he in effect said that there would be a Bill of Rights not long after the Constitution was ratified. And so it was kind of understood by certain states that wanted a Bill of Rights that once it was ratified, the first Congress would come up with a Bill of Rights. And Madison turned out to be in the House of Representatives, and he largely drafted the Bill of Rights in that first Congress.
So this is fascinating. You've just told us that according to the procedure of the Articles of Confederation, the ratification procedure for the Constitution was illegal.
Yes.
So why should we respect the Constitution as valid law today?
Well, power is what it is, and people basically were willing to accept it because they recognized that there was no better system. So yes, if you had a constitutional court, the kind we have today, somebody probably would have gone in and sued and said this is illegal because you can't get rid of the Articles of Confederation this way, because the Articles of Confederation said you can only amend the Articles of Confederation by certain ways that they weren't really honoring.
And the argument on the other side would be, if we, the people of the United States, are sovereign, then we can express our will as we please, regardless of the previous generation's procedures.
That's correct. So ultimately what happened in the ratification was this, to finish this part, there were 13 states, 9 of the 13 was decided it was all that was necessary. So if 9 of the 13 ratified it, it would go into effect, and the other 4, if they didn't ratify, they just wouldn't be part of the system. So they'd be independent or something of that wasn't clear. So the debate went forward. Some states went quickly. All of you probably have seen license plates from Delaware. Anybody ever seen that? It says first in the country. Well, they quickly ratified it unanimously. And a couple other states were unanimously in favor of it. But it wasn't clear that it was going to be approved so clearly in some of the states. Massachusetts, it was very complicated. Virginia was very complicated. New York was very complicated. And in New York, in part because of the concerns about it, some of the people who were interested in getting it approved, John Jay, who was from New York, Madison, and Hamilton, began writing anonymous essays arguing for the approval of it. That later became known as the Federalist Papers, and it was, had some impact on New York. I don't think it had as much impact outside, but that's something you can debate. In any event, New Hampshire became the 9th state. Virginia then had a debate, not knowing that New Hampshire had approved it. Virginia had a debate where they thought they were the 9th state and they were the key state, they were the largest state, and if they didn't approve it, it would probably kill everything. Not knowing that New Hampshire had been the 9th state because things weren't communicating that quickly, Virginia did have a long debate. It narrowly approved of the Constitution, and in effect, it went into effect then.
What were the major arguments in the ratification debates? You've mentioned the Federalist Papers where Hamilton and Madison defended the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists said that Congress had too much power and there was no Bill of Rights. Sketch out the basic tension between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
Well, the Federalists became known as people who wanted a strong federal government. And they were people who really believed that unless you had a strong federal government, you couldn't be a viable country. The Anti-Federalists were people who thought that the states were the prominent and the right source of power, and we shouldn't be taking away power from the states. And that was debated in most of the state constitutions and state conventions, and that was really the debate. Are we giving power to the federal government and creating a whole new power source that could take away our rights and liberties the way King George maybe did? Or do we really want to keep power with the states where we're much closer to the people? And that was the debate. And obviously there were lots of other issues. A lot of people wanted many different changes in the Constitution as they debated. But in the end, it got approved and the government was set up. And the process of amending the Constitution in the future was agreed to as well in the original Constitutional Convention. That was 2/3 of each House and 3/4 of each state. And so when Madison in the first Congress came up with the Bill of Rights, it was actually 12, in effect, amendments agreed to by the House and the Senate. They went to the states. 10 of them were approved, and they became known as the Bill of Rights.
Tell us about those 2 amendments that weren't approved. One of them ended up in the Constitution later, right, and one sort of was lost to history. Yeah,
one was the 12 that actually went out. 2 were not approved. One of them was one that dealt with the way you apportion members to the House of Representatives, to the Congress, and dealt with the apportionment issues, and it really was a technical issue and wasn't addressed. The other one was not making certain that a member of Congress, in effect, couldn't vote for a salary increase in the same Congress that they were in. In other words, if a member of Congress votes for a salary increase, they can't serve in that Congress. They have to wait to the next Congress to get the benefit of that. You can't raise your salary in the same Congress you're in or get another federal job where the salary's been increased while you're a member of Congress.
So as you've just said, the original First Amendment had to do once again with questions of proportional representation. This was obviously big on the founders' mind. Let's talk a little bit about the amendments that didn't get proposed. James Madison thought the most important amendment of all would have required the states, as well as the federal government, to respect basic liberties of speech and religious conscience. That was rejected, and he thought that was a terrible mistake.
He did, and he was a brilliant young man, not educated as a lawyer, as many others of the members of the Constitutional Convention were, but he had studied these issues. He'd been a great friend of Jefferson, and they debated political philosophy and governments, and he'd studied them quite carefully. He really did believe in free speech. He and Jefferson were always concerned that free speech would be taken away for religious or other reasons. They were not people who wanted to have religious considerations dominate what people could say and so forth. And Madison, though, in the end became a pragmatist. He got what he could get done. And he was interesting about his health. He had, as I mentioned earlier, he was a sick man much of his life, but he had what we would now call epilepsy. And he would just go black, as an epileptic might at certain times, and just kind of faint and then come back and then be back able to function. But this was something he had to deal with his whole life, and it was amazing what he was able to accomplish when you consider he had to deal with that among other considerations.
Lynn Cheney, in her great new biography, said that epilepsy affected his attitude of moderation and inclined him toward compromise and made him more sympathetic to balancing both sides.
I think it probably did. He was a person that in the end, he wanted to get things done, and he was probably more political, and she would say in her book, much better politician than Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention. He was ambassador to France at the time, and he was not happy with many of the things in the Constitution, particularly not having a Bill of Rights. He thought that was a major mistake, and Jefferson and Madison were friends for most of their lives, but they disagreed on some things, including how good the Constitution was. Madison was very good at operating behind the scenes. He was not a gifted public speaker. Jefferson was not a gifted public speaker either, and they were concerned, actually, when Virginia was going to approve or not approve the Constitution, that the main person who was against the Constitution was the most eloquent speaker in Virginia. His name was Patrick Henry, the most articulate and great political speaker of the day, also governor of Virginia at one point. And he was dead set against the Constitution because he thought it took away states' rights. Ultimately, he lost that vote, but Madison wasn't able to compete with him with eloquence, but he ultimately got enough votes to get the Constitution approved by Virginia.
Say a little more about this fascinating friendship and then split between Madison and Jefferson. They both wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions denouncing the Adams administrations for prosecuting its enemies for seditious libel, so they stood up for free speech. But at the end of his life, Jefferson was questioning the Union, defending secession in the years leading up to the Civil War, and questioning the power of judges to strike down unconstitutional laws.
Right. Jefferson, well, remember, Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence at the age of 33. And he then went on to a very distinguished career, but he had his fallings out with people, and he was the Secretary of State under George Washington, but he began to say George Washington is not that smart a guy. And when you tell people, the word gets around eventually. And so Washington wasn't that happy with it, and ultimately Jefferson decided to resign and didn't serve as the second term as Secretary of State under Washington, and he and Washington never talked again. They had a very close relationship, but then because Jefferson was very open in his criticisms of Washington's intellect, among other things. Washington and Madison had a very close relationship for most of their lives. Madison really did a lot of things for Washington. Interesting, when Madison was in the House of Representatives, in the first House of Representatives, it would be not uncommon for Madison, to write a letter from the Congress to the President of the United States on behalf of the Congress. Madison would then write the response back from Washington, and then he would write the counter-response from the Congress. Madison would write all of them. He was very close to Washington. Washington really trusted him. I wouldn't say that Washington probably considered him an equal. Washington didn't think many people were equal to him, but they had a very close relationship. The biggest fight between the Founding Fathers, and the most famous one, is really between Jefferson and Hamilton. And Jefferson ultimately was for a weaker federal government and more of what they called a Republican government, where the states still had more rights, and Hamilton wanted a much stronger federal government, and they clashed dramatically many, many times.
All right, I've been a selfish head of the National Constitution Center. I'm so eager to get all this out so we can do our pamphlet that I've not left any time for audience questions. I think I'm going to allow one because it's bad form not to, and then I'm going to ask you to sum up. So who would like to ask David Rubenstein what is
Or you.
sure to be a blockbuster of a question. Yes, sir.
First of all, this is so great and so interesting. Thank you. You talked about George Washington, coming to the convention. What did, how did the presidency then evolve?
Well,
Was it an election? Was he
Yes.
appointed? Was he?
The electoral system that was set up operated very shortly after the Constitution went into effect. The state legislatures were asked to pick electors, and the electors were to then pick the President of the United States. I think there were 69 electors, and it was unanimous for Washington. So somebody came to Mount Vernon and said, "You've just been elected President of the United States." He wasn't dying to do it. He thought he was an old man, I remember, as I said. So at the time, he was, I think, elected President of the United States when he was 56. So he wasn't really dying to do it, and but he took it upon himself, and the capital was then in New York, and he ultimately went up there. Had Washington not been president, I suspect the presidential system wouldn't have evolved as the way it has. He was considered a very domineering person, very strong, and people didn't challenge him as much. Had it been somebody who was unknown, presidency might not have evolved the way it did. So it was known, though, that from the time that they were ratifying it around the states, that Washington would be the first president. Everybody kind of knew that, and I think that was what helped get it approved. Had it been said that, somebody else was going to be president, it probably wouldn't have been approved so readily. So Washington helped a lot, but he hated being president, and he felt that it was difficult to deal with Congress. One time, there's an advice and consent provision in the Congress, in the Constitution, so he actually took it seriously, and so one time he wanted to appoint somebody to a job. He goes up to Congress and talks to them about it, and they complain to him about things and so forth, and they yell at him, and they're complaining about he's not doing a good job running the country. He never went back to the Senate to talk about advice and consent again. He wasn't happy. He actually considered resigning after the first term. He wasn't sure he wanted a second term. Many people wanted him to serve a third term, but he just didn't want to do that. He was not considered a brilliant intellect. He was much smarter than I think people give him credit for, but he had a very good presence about himself and a very dignified way of conducting his affairs, and that's why I think he is rightly said to be the father of the country.
All right, we could go on all morning, but a moderator has to end on time. David, I want your final thoughts. This has been a gripping conversation, as all of ours are. And as we kind of carefully went through the various procedures, I'm struck by how pragmatic these men were. They were thinking about proportional representation. They were dealing with slavery. Were they geniuses at some divine moment, or are these just practical politicians who came up with an effective document? What do you want people to know about the nature of these men who wrote the Constitution?
The Constitution is the oldest Constitution in the world. It's still operating. Think about this. It's only on 4 pages. It was written out on 4 pages. All the amendments, we have 27 amendments, that were written out in the same text, it would be 7 pages. The EU has a Constitution of about 600 pages. So think about it. We have this Constitution has survived for more than 200 years with modest amendments, relatively speaking. So, you don't know whether it was by some enormous amount of luck they came together and the thing kind of worked. It had its problems. The biggest flaw was still not getting rid of slavery, and that ultimately led to the Civil War because they didn't really address it properly in the Constitutional Convention if they could. But think about this. Two thoughts I'd like you to leave with. One, that the Constitution is something that we should know more about. It really conducts it's really responsible way we conduct our lives, and I think people should know more about it. And a lot of us at the National Constitution Center and other places are working on efforts to get people to learn more about it, particularly young people, because young people know so little about the Constitution, and much more than they need to know much more than they actually do. And I think we ought to have much more in the way of civics education. Second, think about what the Constitution would be today if the 55 people had been half female, half male. I'd say an appropriate percentage, 30% Jewish.
40.
40, maybe. But think about it. Suppose we had a truly representative group that was in the Constitutional Convention, representative of the society then or even today. Would the Constitution be much different? How would it be different? And think about this. If we were to take 55 very talented men and women and put them together for 4 months, if they could tolerate it, in a setting that was more commodious than the Independence Hall, which had no air conditioning and was very hot and all that, flies all the time, the gigantic flies flying around, all so forth. But and outhouses were not all that convenient and so forth. If you had a more convenient way and had 55 people coming together and their representative, what will we come up with? Would it be better than what we have today? It might well be different for sure, but the idea that 55 people would come together and come up with a system that's still largely in effect 200 plus years later is amazing. Thank you.
Yes.